The Marquis inherited a bankrupt estate and discovered the groundskeeper's daughter had been saving it in secret. The rain came down in sheets across the Hudson Valley that November afternoon, turning the long gravel driveway into a river of mud and memory. Alexander Marquis, the third generation to bear that surname, though everyone back in Manhattan had taken to calling him the Marquis after his grandfather's obsession with French aristocracy, sat in his rental car at the iron gates of Thornfield Estate, watching water cascade off the rusted metalwork. The house beyond looked like something out of a Gothic novel, all grey stone and dark windows, surrounded by overgrown gardens that had once been featured in Architectural Digest. His grandfather had died 3 months ago, and the lawyers had been frustratingly vague about the estate's condition. Complications, they'd said. Outstanding debts. Alexander had imagined selling it quickly, using the funds to finally open his own architecture firm instead of working under his father's shadow at Marquis and Associates in the city. But looking at the place now, through the November gloom, he wondered if there was anything left to sell. He drove through the open gates, noting the way they actually worked despite their appearance, and parked in front of the main house. The rain had eased to a drizzle, and as he stepped out, he noticed the gardens weren't quite as wild as they'd seemed from a distance. Someone had been maintaining them, not perfectly but with clear intention. The rose bushes were pruned, the pathways mostly clear, the fountain in the circular drive recently cleaned. Before we continue with Alexander's story, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel if you're enjoying this journey. And please, leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community around the world. Now, let's return to Thornfield Estate and the discoveries waiting there. Alexander was reaching for his suitcase when he heard the sound of footsteps on gravel. He turned to find a woman approaching from the direction of what looked like old stables, her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, work gloves tucked into the pocket of a canvas jacket that had seen better days. She moved with the easy confidence of someone who belonged here, and for a moment Alexander felt like the intruder. "Mr. Marquis?" she asked, stopping a respectful distance away. Her voice carried the soft accent of the region, not quite rural, but definitely not city. "I'm Eliza Brennan. I suppose I'm the groundskeeper, though that's not quite accurate anymore." Alexander shook her offered hand, noting the calluses and strength in her grip. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe late 20s, with earth under her fingernails and eyes the color of the Hudson in winter, that deep grey blue that could look gentle or fierce depending on the light. "I wasn't aware the estate still had staff." "It doesn't, officially." She withdrew her hand, tucking it back into her jacket pocket. "My father was the groundskeeper for 30 years. When he passed 2 years ago, I just kept coming. Someone had to." "The estate couldn't have been paying you." Alexander had seen the financial statements. Thornfield had been hemorrhaging money for the better part of a decade. "No," Eliza said simply, "but I grew up here. These gardens, the orchards, the greenhouse, they're not just plants to me. And your grandfather, before he got too sick to manage things, he was kind to my family. I couldn't just let it all die." They stood there in the drizzle for a moment, and Alexander felt something shift in his understanding of the situation. This wasn't just a bankrupt estate he'd inherited. It was a place where people had built lives, had histories deeper than balance sheets and property deeds. "I should show you inside," Eliza said, pulling a keyring from her pocket. "The heat works, mostly. I've been keeping it on low to prevent pipe damage, but you'll want to turn it up tonight. Gets cold up here once the sun goes down." The interior of Thornfield was both worse and better than Alexander had imagined. The furniture was draped in dust covers, the paintings removed, sold off years ago, he guessed, to cover debts. But the floors were swept, the windows clean, and when Eliza led him through to the kitchen, he found it fully functional, with evidence of recent use. a coffee mug in the sink, a small plate, crumbs from what looked like homemade bread. "You've been living here?" he asked. Eliza's cheeks colored slightly. "Not living. I come during the day. There's an office in the East Wing where I keep the estate records, maintenance logs, that sort of thing. I eat lunch here sometimes. I hope that's all right. I can stop if—" "No, it's fine." Alexander set his suitcase down, suddenly exhausted by the 4-hour drive and the weight of everything this place represented. "I'm grateful, actually. I don't know what I would have walked into without you keeping things together." "There's soup," Eliza offered, moving toward the stove with the ease of long familiarity. "I made too much yesterday. You must be hungry after the drive from the city." Alexander was hungry, and more than that, he was curious about this woman who'd spent 2 years maintaining an estate that wasn't hers, with no compensation out of loyalty to a memory. As Eliza heated the soup, a rich vegetable and barley that smelled like comfort itself, he found himself watching the way she moved through the kitchen, knowing exactly where everything was, her hands confident and capable. "How bad is it?" he asked when they sat down at the heavy oak table, steaming bowls between them. "The financial situation, I mean. The lawyers wouldn't give me specifics." Eliza was quiet for a moment, stirring her soup. "It's complicated. That's what everyone keeps saying, because it's true." She met his eyes, and he saw something there, a guardedness maybe, or a calculation about how much to reveal. "Your grandfather made some unfortunate investments. The 2008 crash hit him hard, and he never really recovered. He took out loans against the property, tried to keep up appearances. By the time he got sick, the debt was substantial." "How substantial?" "Just under $2 million. Alexander felt the number like a physical blow. He'd known it was bad, but this was catastrophic. Jesus. No wonder the lawyers were vague. This place isn't an asset, it's a liability. "Maybe," Eliza said carefully. "Or maybe it's something else." Before he could ask what she meant, she stood and carried her bowl to the sink. "I should go. There are linens in the upstairs closet, and I've marked which bedrooms are in the best condition. The master suite has some water damage from a leak last spring, but the blue room at the end of the hall is clean and dry." "Wait." Alexander stood too, following her to the kitchen door. "You said maybe it's something else. What did you mean?" Eliza paused with her hand on the doorknob, rain still pattering against the windows. "I meant that value isn't always about money, Mr. Marquis, but I suppose that's something you'll have to figure out for yourself. I'll be back tomorrow morning if you need anything." She was gone before he could respond, disappearing into the November dusk like she belonged to it. Alexander stood in the warm kitchen of a house he'd never wanted, inherited from a grandfather he'd barely known, and felt the first stirrings of something he couldn't quite name, interest, maybe, or intrigue, or the sense that nothing about Thornfield Estate was going to be as simple as signing papers and walking away. He spent that evening exploring the house, finding spaces that felt frozen in time, and others that showed clear signs of recent care. In his grandfather's study, he discovered files meticulously organized, bills paid up until 3 months ago, right around when the old man had died. Someone had been managing the estate's minimal affairs, keeping the lights on and the property taxes current despite the crushing debt. The blue room was exactly as Eliza had described, clean and comfortable, with fresh sheets that smelled of lavender. As Alexander lay in bed that night, listening to the old house settle around him and the rain drum against the roof, he thought about the groundskeeper's daughter, who'd spent 2 years saving a place that wasn't hers, for reasons she hadn't fully explained. He fell asleep wondering what else she hadn't told him, and why that question felt more important than all the financial problems he'd come here to solve. The next morning arrived cold and clear, frost sparkling on the overgrown lawns and the distant hills painted in the last colors of autumn. Alexander woke to the smell of coffee and found Eliza already in the kitchen, a laptop open on the table beside a stack of ledgers that looked decades old. "I hope you don't mind," she said without looking up. "I have a key, and I thought we should go over the estate accounts. You'll need to understand the full situation before you make any decisions." Alexander poured himself coffee from the pot she'd made, strong and perfect, and sat across from her. In the morning light, he could see the weariness in her face, the way she'd probably been up for hours already, preparing for this conversation. "Show me everything," he said. What Eliza showed him over the next several hours was a masterclass in creative financial management. Yes, the estate owed nearly $2 million across various creditors, but somehow, over the past 2 years, she'd managed to keep the property from foreclosure through a patchwork of small revenue streams she'd created, renting the orchards to a local cidery, selling produce from the greenhouse to restaurants in Cold Spring and Beacon, leasing the stable building to an equestrian therapy program for veterans. "None of it's enough to cover the debt," Eliza explained, her finger tracing columns in a spreadsheet. "But it's enough to make the minimum payments, keep the wolves at bay. Your grandfather's life insurance paid off the property taxes for the next 5 years, which gives us breathing room." "Us?" Alexander looked up from the ledger he'd been studying. Eliza's cheeks colored again, that same flush he'd noticed yesterday. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to presume. I've been managing this for so long it feels like mine to protect. But it's not. It's yours now." I didn't mean it as criticism," Alexander said carefully. "I'm just trying to understand. You've been running this place, essentially for free, keeping it alive against impossible odds. Why?" Eliza closed her laptop and stood, walking to the window that overlooked the eastern gardens. "My mother died when I was 7, she said after a long moment. "Cancer. Fast and cruel. My father was destroyed by it, could barely function. Your grandfather gave him this job when no one else would hire a man who showed up to interviews, red-eyed and shaking. He gave us the cottage by the creek, let my dad bring me to work, made sure I had someone to watch me, while he learned to be a single parent." She turned from the window, and Alexander saw the fierce loyalty in her expression. "I grew up in these gardens. Your grandfather taught me about roses, about the old apple varieties in the orchard, about maintaining something beautiful, because beauty matters, not because it's profitable. When my dad got sick, lung cancer, same as your grandfather, they were in treatment together sometimes. Your grandfather made sure my dad's insurance covered everything, even after he was too sick to work." "I never knew my grandfather was like that," Alexander admitted. "My father always talked about him as this distant figure, more concerned with his collections and his status than with people." "Maybe he was both," Eliza said. "People are complicated, but to me, to my father, he was kind. And when they both died within months of each other, when I realized this place was going to be carved up and sold off because no one else cared enough to fight for it, I couldn't let that happen. Not without trying everything I could think of to save it." Alexander looked at the spreadsheets, the ledgers, the evidence of 2 years of unpaid labor and fierce determination. "You know this can't last, though. Even with everything you've done, the debt is too large. Eventually, the creditors will force a sale." "Maybe," Eliza said, echoing her words from the night before. "Or maybe there's another way." "What way?" "Come with me," she said, grabbing a heavy jacket from the hook by the door. "There's something I need to show you." They walked through the frost-crisp morning, past the greenhouse where Eliza pointed out the heirloom tomato plants she was preparing for winter, past the stables where he could hear horses and voices from the therapy program. She led him beyond the manicured grounds into what had once been formal gardens, but now looked like wilderness, until they rounded a bend and Alexander saw it. A walled garden, maybe 2 acres, completely hidden from the main house by careful landscaping. And inside, organized in neat rows and clearly marked beds, was what looked like a botanical research facility. Plants Alexander didn't recognize grew in carefully controlled sections, some under glass, some in the open air. A small greenhouse at the center held what looked like laboratory equipment. "What is this?" Alexander asked, following Eliza through the gate. "Your grandfather's last project," she said, her voice soft with something like reverence. "He started it about 5 years ago, before he got too sick to manage it. He was working with a botanist from Cornell, trying to develop disease-resistant variants of heritage apple varieties. The idea was to preserve genetic diversity while creating commercially viable crops that could survive climate change." She led him to the greenhouse, where detailed notes covered the walls alongside photographs of different apple varieties in various stages of development. "It's brilliant work, Alexander. Potentially worth millions if the research is completed and the varieties can be patented. But it needs another 2 years minimum, and funding and expertise your grandfather didn't have time to finish bringing together." Alexander felt his architect's mind start to turn over the possibilities, seeing not just plants, but potential, not just a bankrupt estate, but a research facility with genuine scientific value. "Does anyone know about this?" "Just me and Dr. Chen from Cornell. She's been coming once a month on her own time, helping me keep the experiments going. She thinks if we can get funding and official backing, we could save not just the estate, but create something genuinely important for agriculture." "Why didn't you tell the lawyers? This could change everything about the estate's value." Eliza's expression turned guarded. "Because I don't trust them to understand what this is. I've seen how these things work. They'd want to sell the research to some agribusiness corporation that would patent everything and lock it away. Your grandfather wanted this to be accessible, to help small farmers and heritage orchards. He wanted it to matter beyond just making money." "And you think I'm different?" Alexander asked, curious about why she'd chosen to show him this now. "I think you might be," Eliza said, meeting his eyes with that same fierce intensity he'd seen when she talked about her father. "I've been researching you, Mr. Marquis. You designed that community center in the Bronx, the one that won the AIA award last year. You could have taken a corporate job designing office towers, but you chose projects that matter to people. So, yes, I think you might understand that some things are worth more than their price tag." "Amay!" They stood in the greenhouse surrounded by careful science and patient hope, and Alexander felt the project he'd imagined, sell the estate quickly, take the money, start his firm, begin to dissolve like morning mist. Because Eliza was right. He did understand the value of things that couldn't be measured in quarterly earnings. And more than that, he was beginning to understand the value of people who fought for those things, who spent 2 years of unpaid labor saving something they believed in simply because it was worth saving. "Show me everything," he said for the second time that day, but this time with different weight behind the words. "The research, the financials, all of it. If there's a way to make this work, I want to find it." Eliza's smile was like sunrise, transforming her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful, and Alexander felt something in his chest shift and settle, a recognition he wasn't quite ready to name but couldn't ignore. He'd come to Thornfield expecting to tie up loose ends and return to his real life in Manhattan. But standing in his grandfather's secret garden with a woman who'd devoted 2 years to saving a stranger's legacy, Alexander began to suspect that maybe this was his real life, and everything else had just been preparation for finding it. They spent the rest of that week immersed in the details of the estate and the research project. Eliza introduced him to Dr. Sarah Chen, who arrived on Wednesday with folders full of documentation about the apple varieties and their potential market value. The botanist was in her 50s, sharp-eyed and passionate, and she didn't mince words about the situation. What Frederick was working on here could revolutionize heritage agriculture, she said, spreading photographs across the kitchen table. These varieties are resistant to fire blight and apple scab, two of the biggest threats to orchard sustainability. But we're at a critical juncture. Without proper funding and institutional support, we'll lose years of careful cultivation. What would proper funding look like? Alexander asked, his mind already working through possibilities. About 300,000 for the next 2 years, Dr. Chen said. That would cover lab work, patent applications, field trials, and bringing in additional researchers. It's not small money, but compared to the potential return, both economic and environmental, it's modest. $300,000 might as well have been $3 million, given the estate's current debt situation. But as they talked through the research, and Alexander saw the way Eliza's face lit up, discussing the different apple varieties, he found himself thinking about creative solutions. His father's firm had connections to agricultural investment groups, to universities with grant programs, to sustainable development funds. More than that, the estate itself could be repositioned. Instead of a liability, it could become a research facility, potentially qualifying for different types of funding and tax structures. Alexander's architectural training wasn't just about designing buildings. It was about seeing potential in spaces others had written off, about understanding how form and function could serve larger purposes. "I need to make some calls," he told them, standing to pace the length of the kitchen. "And I need to see all the properties on the estate, not just the gardens and orchards, but everything, the outbuildings, the unused structures, the land itself." Eliza exchanged a look with Dr. Chen, something passing between them that Alexander couldn't quite read. "There's more," Eliza said carefully. "Things I haven't shown you yet because I wasn't sure. I didn't know if you'd understand their value." "Show me," Alexander said simply. Over the next several days, as November deepened toward December and the first real snow dusted the hills, Eliza revealed the full scope of what she'd been protecting. There was the old carriage house she'd converted into a workshop, where she propagated plants and built the raised beds for the garden, the ice house partially collapsed that could be restored as temperature-controlled storage for the research. A series of greenhouses beyond the walled garden, damaged but salvageable, that could expand the growing capacity exponentially. And then there were the records. In the estate office, Eliza showed him filing cabinets full of correspondence between his grandfather and various botanists, agricultural experts, and small farmers from across the country. Frederick Marquis hadn't just been preserving plants. He'd been building a network, a community of people who cared about heritage agriculture and sustainable farming. He was planning to turn Thornfield into a teaching facility, Eliza explained, pulling out architectural drawings that looked decades old. "See, here are his notes about converting the East Wing into classrooms, about bringing in apprentices to learn heritage cultivation techniques. He never got to implement it, but the vision was there." Alexander studied the drawings, seeing echoes of his own architectural philosophy in his grandfather's plans, spaces designed for learning and community, for passing on knowledge rather than hoarding it. Why didn't he do this instead of taking out loans to maintain the estate as it was? Pride, maybe, Eliza said softly. Or fear of what your father would think. He talked sometimes about how disappointed your father was when he left corporate law to focus on plants and gardens. I think he wanted to prove the estate could still be what it had always been, even while trying to make it something new. Alexander thought about his own relationship with his father, about the constant pressure to conform to the Marquis and Associates' vision instead of pursuing his own architectural philosophy. My father thinks anything that doesn't generate immediate profit is a waste of time. What do you think? Eliza asked, and the question felt weighted with more than just curiosity about his opinion on agriculture. "I think," Alexander said slowly, "that my father has never created anything beautiful in his life. He's built office towers and shopping centers, and they're all efficient and profitable and completely soulless. I became an architect because I wanted to make spaces that matter to people, that improve their lives in ways you can't measure on a balance sheet." He turned from the drawings to look at Eliza directly. "This place, what you've been protecting, what my grandfather was building, it matters, not because of what it's worth financially, but because of what it could mean for people who care about heritage farming, about preserving biodiversity, about building something sustainable. I want to save it, Eliza, not just the research, but the whole vision." The relief in Eliza's expression was profound, and Alexander realized just how heavy the burden she'd been carrying must have been. 2 years of fighting alone to protect a dead man's dream, never sure if anyone would understand or care enough to help. "So what do we do?" she asked. "We fight," Alexander said. "We find funding. We restructure the debt. We turn this place into what it was always meant to be. And we do it together." The word "together" hung in the air between them, and Alexander saw the moment Eliza registered it, saw her eyes widen slightly and her breath catch. Because somewhere in the past week, amid spreadsheets and apple varieties and discussions about heritage agriculture, something had shifted between them. The professional distance of estate owner and groundskeeper had blurred into partnership, and beneath that partnership was a current of attraction neither of them had acknowledged yet. But standing in the estate office with snow falling outside and the weight of shared purpose settling around them, Alexander felt it clearly. The pull toward this woman who'd spent 2 years fighting for something she believed in, who knew the value of beauty and persistence, who moved through the world with quiet competence and fierce loyalty. He saw in her eyes that she felt it too, and saw also the uncertainty there, the awareness of all the reasons why this was complicated. He was her employer now, technically. He lived in Manhattan, she in the Hudson Valley cottage where she'd grown up. He came from money and private schools, she from working-class roots and community college. The distance between their worlds should have been unbridgeable. But maybe, Alexander thought, watching her tuck a strand of dark hair behind her ear and turn back to the files as if she could hide the moment of connection. Maybe distance was just another problem that could be solved with the right vision and enough determination. "We should start with Cornell," Eliza said, her voice deliberately steady and professional. "Dr. Chen thinks they might have grant programs that could cover some of the research costs. And there's a sustainable agriculture conference in Albany next month. We could present your grandfather's work, try to attract institutional support." "Good," Alexander said, matching her tone because he understood the need to step back, to keep things uncomplicated while they navigated the immediate crisis. "I'll reach out to some contacts at Columbia, see if they have programs that might be relevant. And I need to have a serious conversation with my father's lawyers about restructuring the estate's debt." They worked side by side for the rest of the afternoon, building a strategy to save Thornfield that felt audacious and barely possible, but not quite impossible. As the winter sun set early, painting the snow golden and then purple, Alexander found himself not wanting to let Eliza leave for the cottage, not wanting to spend the evening alone in the big house. "Stay for dinner," he said when she started gathering her things. "I'll cook. I'm actually decent at it, despite what you might assume about a guy from Manhattan." Eliza hesitated, and Alexander could see the calculation behind her eyes. The weighing of professional boundaries against personal desire. "Okay," she said finally, "but I'll help. This is still my kitchen after all." They cooked together, pasta with vegetables from the greenhouse, bread Eliza had baked that morning, wine from a local vineyard she'd connected with for the estate's revenue streams. It felt domestic and easy, their movements around each other synchronized like they'd done this 100 times before. They talked about everything except the estate, her love of botanical illustration, his passion for sustainable architecture, shared frustrations with bureaucracy and short-sighted thinking. "I wanted to be a landscape designer," Eliza admitted over dessert, apple crisp made from the estate's orchard fruit. "I got accepted to a program at Cornell, actually. But my father got sick right around then, and someone needed to take care of him, to manage his treatments and keep the cottage running. So I deferred for a year, and then another year, and then he died, and I was here managing the estate, and it just never seemed like the right time." "It's not too late," Alexander said. "You're what, 28, 29? 27, but it feels late when you've spent 2 years pouring everything into a place that's not even yours, that could still be sold off for parts despite everything." "It won't be," Alexander said with more confidence than he felt. "We're going to save it, Eliza, and when we do, when this place becomes the research and teaching facility my grandfather envisioned, you should run it. You should go back to school, get that degree, and then come back here and build something extraordinary." Eliza's eyes shimmered with tears. She blinked away quickly. "You barely know me. How can you have that much faith in what I could do?" "Because," Alexander said simply, "I've seen what you've already done with no resources, no support, and no guarantee anyone would ever appreciate it. Imagine what you could do with actual funding and institutional backing." Boo! They sat in comfortable silence after that, the kind that comes not from having nothing to say, but from having said something true enough to need no elaboration. Eventually, Eliza stood to clear the dishes, and Alexander helped, their hands brushing as they worked, each touch electric and carefully ignored. At the door, pulling on her jacket to walk back to the cottage through the December cold, Eliza paused. "Thank you," she said softly, "for seeing what this place could be, for caring about my father's memory and your grandfather's vision, for everything." "Thank you for saving it until I got here to help," Alexander replied. Then, before he could second-guess the impulse, he leaned forward and kissed her forehead, gentle and brief. "Sleep well, Eliza." He watched her walk into the snowy night, her flashlight bobbing down the path toward the cottage, and knew with certainty that he was in trouble. Because saving Thornfield wasn't just about preserving his grandfather's legacy anymore. It was about building a future he could barely imagine but desperately wanted. A future where he could wake up in this house overlooking these gardens and find Eliza in the kitchen making coffee, where they could work side by side on projects that mattered, where the distance between their worlds didn't matter because they'd built a new world together. But first, they had to save the estate. And that, Alexander was beginning to realize, was going to be far more complicated than he'd anticipated. The complications began the following Monday when Alexander's father called, his voice sharp with displeasure. "I've been reviewing the Thornfield situation," Richard Marquis said without preamble. "The property has significant debt and minimal assets. The logical course is to file for bankruptcy, liquidate what's salvageable, and be done with this entire mess your grandfather created." Alexander had been expecting this conversation, but the cold efficiency in his father's voice still stung. "There are other options. The botanical research alone could be worth millions if properly developed." "Speculative value," his father dismissed. "Which means no value at all until someone actually writes a check. Meanwhile, the estate continues hemorrhaging money on taxes and maintenance. I've already spoken with the creditors. They're willing to accept a structured sale. We could have this wrapped up by March." "I'm not selling," Alexander said, surprised by the steel in his own voice. "I'm going to restructure the debt and develop the property as a research and teaching facility. There's precedent for this kind of thing. Agricultural institutions, botanical gardens, heritage sites that operate as non-profits with grant funding." His father's silence was heavy with disapproval. You're talking about years of work and substantial capital investment with no guarantee of return. This is exactly the kind of impractical thinking that drove your grandfather into bankruptcy in the first place. Or maybe, Alexander countered, it's the kind of thinking that creates something meaningful instead of just profitable. Not everything has to be measured in quarterly earnings, Dad. Spoken like someone who's never had to make payroll or face investors, Richard shot back. I gave you this opportunity to handle the estate sale because I thought you were ready for real responsibility. If you're going to make decisions based on sentiment instead of sense, I'll have the lawyers take over. You can't do that. The estate is mine, legally. Grandfather left it to me specifically. And if you default on the debt because you're pursuing this fantasy of yours, the creditors will force a sale anyway. You have until the end of the year to show me a viable plan, Alexander, or I'm stepping in, whether you like it or not. The call ended there, leaving Alexander staring at his phone in the quiet estate office. End of year. That gave him 3 weeks to put together a comprehensive plan that would satisfy creditors, attract funding partners, and prove to his father that Thornfield could be more than just a beautiful money pit. He went looking for Eliza and found her in the greenhouse with Dr. Chen, both of them huddled over a microscope examining leaf samples. When he explained the situation, Dr. Chen nodded grimly. "I was afraid of this," she said. "Agricultural research timelines don't mesh well with financial crisis deadlines, but there might be options. Cornell has an emergency funding program for heritage preservation projects. I could fast-track an application, though it's competitive, and the approval process usually takes months." "We don't have months," Alexander said. "No," Dr. Chen agreed, "but I have colleagues in the State Agriculture Department, and there's a preservation grant that's less competitive because it requires matching private investment. If you could secure even partial private funding, the state grant could match it up to 200,000. Alexander's mind raced through possibilities. He had some money of his own, inheritance from his maternal grandmother, but not nearly enough. He'd need investors, and that meant presenting Thornfield not as a charity project, but as a viable business venture. "What if we positioned it as a commercial operation?" he said slowly. "Not just research, but production. If we could prove the disease-resistant varieties work at scale, we could license them to orchards and nurseries, create an actual revenue stream while preserving the heritage genetics." Dr. Chen's eyes lit up. "That could work. I know several organic orchards that would pay premium prices for certified disease-resistant heritage stock. And if we could get ADA certification for the propagation facility, we could sell to the wholesale market. But we'd need to show proof of concept," Eliza said, her practical mind cutting to the chase, "which means we'd need to have successful propagation and at least preliminary field trial results to present to investors. How long would that take?" "We have preliminary results now," Dr. Chen said, pulling up files on her tablet. 3 years of cultivation data, disease resistance testing, early yield comparisons. It's not comprehensive, but it's enough to demonstrate viability. The problem is packaging it in a way that business people will understand. "That's where I come in," Alexander said, feeling the pieces start to align. "I'll put together a business plan and architectural renderings showing how the facility could be developed. We'll need projections, market analysis, a clear timeline from investment to revenue generation." They worked for the next 2 weeks like people possessed, racing against Alexander's father's deadline and the looming threat of forced liquidation. Dr. Chen provided the scientific data and market analysis. Eliza compiled every record of the estate's operations, showing how her revenue streams had kept the property functioning on minimal resources. Alexander designed the facility expansion and created financial projections that showed realistic paths to sustainability. The nights were long, the three of them often working past midnight in the estate office, surrounded by coffee cups and spreading documents across every surface. Eliza would emerge from the cottage with thermoses of soup and fresh bread, refusing to let them subsist on takeout. Dr. Chen brought expertise and connections, making calls to potential partners and grant administrators, building the network that could support Thornfield's transformation. And through it all, Alexander and Eliza circled each other carefully, professionally, maintaining the boundaries that kept their collaboration from crossing into the territory both of them felt pulling like gravity. But the awareness was always there. In the brush of hands passing documents, in lingering eye contact over the table, in the way Eliza's voice softened when she said his name, and the way Alexander found excuses to stand close enough to catch the scent of earth and lavender that seemed to cling to her hair. On December 20th, with the deadline just days away, they had something approaching a complete proposal. Alexander called a meeting with his father's lawyers, insisting Richard attend in person. His father arrived at Thornfield looking skeptical and impatient, barely acknowledging Eliza and Dr. Chen before demanding to see what Alexander had prepared. The presentation took 2 hours. Alexander walked them through the research data, the business model, the architectural plans for developing the facility. Dr. Chen explained the market potential for disease-resistant heritage varieties and the growing demand for sustainable agriculture solutions. Eliza presented the estate's existing revenue streams and expansion possibilities. When they finished, Richard Marquis sat back in his chair, expression unreadable. "This is more thorough than I expected," he admitted grudgingly, "but it's still speculative. You're asking for significant investment based on research that hasn't been peer-reviewed and market demand that hasn't been tested at scale." "All investment involves risk," Alexander countered. "But this is calculated risk based on solid science and genuine need. The agricultural industry is facing climate crisis challenges that heritage genetics could help solve. We're not creating demand, we're meeting it." "And who exactly do you expect to provide this investment?" "Banks won't touch agricultural research without substantial collateral. I have some money of my own," Alexander said. "About 80,000 from my grandmother's estate. Combined with the matching state grant Dr. Chen is applying for, that gives us close to 300,000. Enough to fund the first phase of development and prove commercial viability." His father's expression shifted to something sharper. "You're planning to invest your entire inheritance in this?" "Yes." "That's insane. That money was meant to give you security, independence. If this fails, you'll have nothing." "If I don't try, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what could have been possible," Alexander said quietly. "I'd rather risk failure than live with that kind of regret." They locked eyes across the table, and Alexander saw something complex move through his father's expression. Surprise, maybe, or reluctant respect, or possibly just the recognition that his son had inherited more of Frederick Marquette's stubborn idealism than Richard had hoped. "Fine," Richard said eventually. "You have until spring to prove this can work. If the state grant comes through and you can show actual progress on commercial development, I'll restructure the estate debt through the firm." 6 months, Alexander. That's what I'm giving you." It wasn't everything Alexander had hoped for, but it was enough. After the lawyers left, after his father drove back to Manhattan without another word, Alexander found himself standing in the estate office with Eliza and Dr. Chen, all three of them exhausted and exhilarated. "You did it," Eliza said, her voice full of wonder. "You actually convinced him." "We did it," Alexander corrected. "This was never just me. This was all of us." Dr. Chen excused herself then, claiming she needed to get back to Cornell before the snow got worse. But Alexander saw the knowing look she gave Eliza on her way out, and suddenly they were alone in the quiet office, snow falling outside and the future spreading before them like uncharted territory. "You're really going to invest everything you have in this?" Eliza said, not quite a question. "Yes." "Why?" "Because it matters," Alexander said simply. "And because—" He stopped, the truth of what he wanted to say too large and too frightening to speak aloud yet. But Eliza stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. "Because," she prompted softly. "Because I can't imagine walking away from this place," Alexander admitted. "From what we could build here. From—" He hesitated again, but Eliza's hand found his, her fingers threading through his with easy certainty. "From me?" she asked, and there was fear in her voice, but also hope, the same hope that was probably written all over his own face. "Yes," Alexander breathed. "From you." Eliza kissed him then, or maybe he kissed her. Later, neither of them would be sure who moved first, only that suddenly they were together, her hands in his hair and his arms around her waist. 2 weeks of careful restraint, dissolving in the heat of finally giving in to what had been building between them since that first rain-soaked afternoon. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Eliza laughed shakily. "This is complicated." "I know. I work for you, technically." "Not really," Alexander said, tucking hair behind her ear with gentle fingers. "This is a partnership, Eliza. It always has been. Your father will hate this. My working-class background, my lack of degree, everything. I don't care what my father thinks. I live in a cottage that probably needs a new roof," Eliza continued, like she was listing all the reasons this couldn't work, all the obstacles that should stop them. "You live in Manhattan in what's probably a beautiful apartment with a doorman and everything." "I live here now," Alexander said firmly, "or I will once we get through winter and start the real work of building this place into what it's meant to be. And Eliza—" He cupped her face in his hands, making sure she met his eyes. "I don't care about the money or the background or any of it. I care about you, about who you are and what you fought for and how you see the world. That's what matters to me." Tears spilled down her cheeks, and Alexander kissed them away, tasting salt and wonder. "I've never—" Eliza started, then stopped, shaking her head. "No one's ever chosen me before. Not like this, not knowing all the complicated parts." "Then everyone before was an idiot," Alexander said, making her laugh through the tears. "And I'm choosing you, Eliza Brennan, complications and all, if you'll have me." "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll have you." They kissed again, slower this time, learning each other with the patience of people who finally had time to explore what they'd found. Eventually, they made their way to the kitchen, to soup and bread and continued planning, but now with hands held across the table and stolen kisses between discussion of grant applications and architectural permits. The future still held enormous challenges: debt to restructure, research to complete, a father to prove wrong, and all the ordinary obstacles of building a relationship across class and cultural divides. But standing in the kitchen where Eliza had first offered him soup, where they'd spent countless hours planning Thornfield's salvation, Alexander felt certain they could weather whatever came. Because sometimes the most valuable inheritance wasn't money or property. Sometimes it was finding the person who saw the world the same way you did, who fought for the same things, who understood that beauty and meaning mattered more than profit margins. Alexander had come to Thornfield expecting to find a problem to solve. Instead, he'd found a purpose worth fighting for and a woman worth building a future with. And as snow fell over the Hudson Valley and they planned the next steps of their impossible project, he knew with absolute certainty that this, all of this, was exactly where he was meant to be. The winter months that followed were a masterclass in determination and hope. The state grant came through in mid-January, and with it, the ability to formally hire Eliza as Thornfield's operations director and Dr. Chen as lead researcher. Alexander's father made good on his word, restructuring the estate's debt in a way that gave them breathing room, though his disapproval radiated through every phone call and terse email. "He'll come around," Alexander told Eliza one frozen February morning as they reviewed architectural plans for the greenhouse expansion. "Once he sees this actually working, once we have concrete results to show him." "Maybe," Eliza said, though her doubt was clear. "Or maybe he'll always see me as the groundskeeper's daughter who trapped his son into throwing away his future." Alexander set down his coffee cup with enough force to make Eliza look up. "First, you didn't trap anyone. I chose this. And second, you're not just the groundskeeper's daughter. You're the operations director of what's going to be one of the most important heritage agriculture facilities in the country. Stop selling yourself short." "That's easy for you to say," Eliza shot back with rare sharpness. "You've had every advantage. Private schools, connections, money. You don't know what it's like to walk into rooms where people assume you're the help instead of an equal participant." "You're right," Alexander admitted. "I don't know. But I do know that you've accomplished more with limited resources than most people with all the advantages could dream of. And anyone who can't see your value isn't worth your time or emotional energy." They'd had versions of this argument several times over the past weeks, Eliza's insecurity about their class differences bumping up against Alexander's sometimes oblivious privilege. It was hard work navigating the gap between their worlds, learning to see each other clearly while acknowledging the real structural differences that shaped their experiences. But they were learning. Alexander was educating himself about economic inequality and the real barriers Eliza faced. Eliza was working on believing she deserved the opportunities opening before her, and both of them were committed to building something together that transcended their individual backgrounds. "I'm sorry," Eliza said after a moment, reaching for his hand across the scattered plans. "I know you're on my side. I just get scared sometimes that this is all too good to be real, that something's going to come along and prove I was right to keep my expectations low." "That's trauma talking," Alexander said gently, "from growing up with so much loss and uncertainty. But Eliza, this is real, we're real, and we're going to make this work." The work was relentless but rewarding. By March, they had the first greenhouse expansion completed, with temperature-controlled environments for different growth stages. Dr. Chen brought in 2 graduate students from Cornell to help with the propagation work, and suddenly Thornfield was buzzing with activity. Researchers taking samples, students learning heritage cultivation techniques, Eliza managing operations with the competence Alexander had recognized in her from the start. The first commercial sale came in April, 100 disease-resistant heritage apple saplings to an organic orchard in the Finger Lakes region. It wasn't a fortune, but it was proof of concept, validation that the market they'd projected actually existed. More orders followed, and by May they had a waiting list for the next year's propagation cycle. Alexander's father made his first visit to see the progress in late May, arriving unannounced on a Tuesday morning. Alexander found him walking through the greenhouses with Eliza, asking sharp questions about the propagation protocols and commercial projections. Watching them together, his father in his expensive suit, Eliza in work clothes with dirt under her nails, Alexander braced for criticism. But when Richard found him in the estate office afterward, his expression was complicated. "She's impressive," he said without preamble. "Smart, organized, clearly knows what she's doing. Dr. Chen speaks very highly of her capabilities." "I know," Alexander said carefully, unsure where this was going. "And the facility is professional, well run. The research has genuine merit." His father paused, looking out at the gardens visible through the window. "Your grandfather would have been proud of what you're building here." It was the closest thing to approval Alexander had ever heard from his father about anything that didn't directly serve Marquis and Associates' bottom line. "Thank you," he said quietly. "But I have concerns," Richard continued, turning back to face him. "About you and Miss Brennan. The professional relationship is one thing that's clearly working well, but I understand there's a personal component too." Alexander felt his jaw tighten. "My relationship with Eliza isn't up for discussion." "I'm not trying to interfere," his father said, surprising him. "I'm trying to warn you. You come from different worlds, Alexander. That creates challenges you may not be prepared for. Social expectations, financial dynamics, family reactions. Your mother's already asking uncomfortable questions about when she'll get to meet this woman you're apparently serious about." "Then arrange a dinner," Alexander said. "Let them meet Eliza and see for themselves what an extraordinary person she is. It's not that simple." "Why not? Because she doesn't have the right pedigree? Because she didn't go to the right schools?" Alexander felt old anger rising. "I thought you'd be different, Dad. I thought maybe seeing what we've built here would help you understand that value isn't about where someone comes from." "I do understand that," Richard said, and there was something weary in his voice. "Better than you might think. But understanding it intellectually and navigating it practically are different things. Your grandfather learned that the hard way when he married your grandmother. Her family never accepted that she'd chosen a corporate lawyer instead of old money, and it poisoned things between them for years." Alexander hadn't known that story. His grandmother had died when he was young, and his grandfather had rarely spoken about her. "So what are you saying? That I should give up on Eliza? Because it might be socially complicated?" "No," his father said firmly. "I'm saying you should go into this with eyes open. Understand that there will be people who judge, who assume things about both of you, who make it harder than it needs to be, and decide now, together, how you're going to handle that. Because it will come up, Alexander, probably sooner than you'd like." It was good advice, Alexander realized, even if it came wrapped in his father's particular brand of pessimistic pragmatism. And it sparked a conversation he and Eliza needed to have, about expectations, about the future, about how they wanted to navigate the complicated intersection of their relationship and their work. They had that conversation that evening, walking through the orchards as late spring turned everything green and golden. Alexander explained his father's concerns, expecting Eliza to be defensive or hurt. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully. "He's not wrong," she said. "I've been thinking about this too. What happens when we go to events in the city and I'm underdressed or use the wrong fork? What happens when your family friends assume I'm a gold digger? What happens if we have kids someday and they're caught between our two worlds?" "What happens is we handle it together," Alexander said, taking her hand. "We don't let other people's prejudices define our relationship. We build our own life, our own standards, our own family culture that takes the best from both our backgrounds." "That sounds beautiful in theory," Eliza said. "But in practice?" "In practice," Alexander interrupted gently, "we'll make mistakes and learn and keep choosing each other. That's all any couple can do, Eliza, regardless of their backgrounds. Love isn't about having the same starting point. It's about building toward the same destination." Eliza stopped walking, turning to face him in the dappled light filtering through young leaves. "You said love," she said softly. "Yes," Alexander confirmed, heart pounding. "I love you, Eliza. I'm in love with you. Have been probably since you showed me the walled garden and trusted me with your grandfather's vision." Tears sparkled in Eliza's eyes, catching the golden light. "I love you too," she whispered. "So much, it terrifies me sometimes." "Then let's be terrified together," Alexander said, pulling her close. Let's build this impossible thing, the research facility and the relationship and the life we want. Let's prove everyone wrong who thinks we can't make it work. Eliza kissed him then, deep and certain, a promise sealed in the spring evening with apple blossoms drifting around them like snow. And when they walked back to the house hand in hand, Alexander felt the last piece of doubt dissolve. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, building a future. The challenges came sooner than expected. In June, Alexander's mother insisted on hosting a dinner party in Manhattan to formally introduce Eliza to the family's social circle. Alexander tried to decline, but his mother was insistent, and Eliza surprised him by agreeing to go. "I can't hide forever," she said, while they were shopping for appropriate clothes, an experience that revealed just how different their worlds were when the dress she chose cost more than her monthly grocery budget. "And if we're serious about building a life together, I need to learn to navigate your world just like you're learning to navigate mine." The dinner was exactly as awkward as Alexander had feared. His mother's friends asked Eliza pointed questions about her education and background, their smiles sharp as knives. One woman actually asked if she was intimidated by Alexander's breeding, and another made a comment about how refreshing it was to see someone so natural among them, the implication being that Eliza was uncultured. Alexander watched Eliza handle it with grace he couldn't have managed, answering questions honestly without apologizing for who she was, deflecting rudeness with quiet dignity. But he saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes, and by the time they escaped back to his apartment, she was exhausted. "I'm sorry," he said, pulling her into his arms. "They were awful, and I should have shut it down earlier." "It's fine," Eliza said, but her voice was flat. "I expected it." "That doesn't make it okay." "No," she agreed. "But it's reality, Alexander. This is what dating you means. Navigating rooms full of people who think I'm not good enough, who assume I'm with you for your money or connections. I need to develop thicker skin if we're going to make this work." "Or," Alexander said carefully, "we could just not spend time with people who treat you that way. My mother's social circle isn't important to me. You are." Eliza pulled back to look at him. "But they're your family, your community. I can't ask you to cut ties with your whole world just because they make me uncomfortable." "You're not asking, I'm choosing. There's a difference." They talked long into the night about boundaries and compromises, about which social obligations mattered and which could be declined, about building their own community at Thornfield, with people who valued substance over status. It was hard work, the kind that required honesty and vulnerability from both of them, but by morning they'd found a path forward that felt sustainable. "We'll attend the events that matter to your work," Eliza decided. "The architecture awards, the professional functions where your presence affects your career, but social dinner parties with people who look down on me, we can skip those." "Deal," Alexander agreed. "And you get to veto any event where you feel unwelcome or disrespected." It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was theirs, built on communication and mutual respect. And as summer deepened and Thornfield's first full growing season progressed, they fell into rhythms that felt increasingly like a real partnership, waking up together in the estate house, working side by side during the day, cooking dinner in the kitchen that had become the heart of their shared life. Dr. Chen published the first peer-reviewed paper on the disease-resistant varieties in August, bringing academic credibility to the research. Orders tripled, and by September they were hiring additional staff to manage the propagation work. The estate was transforming from a liability into a genuine business, and Alexander's father, however grudgingly, had to admit the project was succeeding beyond initial projections. But success brought new complications. In October, A large agricultural corporation approached them about buying the research and licensing the varieties exclusively. The offer was substantial, enough to pay off all remaining estate debt, with money left over for Alexander and Eliza to live comfortably for years. "It's everything we've been working for," Eliza said, staring at the offer letter. "Financial security, no more debt, no more worrying about whether we can make payroll." But it's not what my grandfather wanted," Alexander countered. "Exclusive licensing means small farmers and heritage orchards won't have access. It defeats the whole purpose of making this research accessible." "I know," Eliza said quietly. "But Alexander, I'm tired. I've been fighting to save this place for almost 3 years now, and the idea of just accepting the money and being done, it's tempting in a way I didn't expect." Alexander understood. The weight of keeping Thornfield running, of proving the project viable, of constantly justifying their choices to skeptical family members and creditors, it was exhausting for both of them. The offer represented an easy exit, a chance to build a life without the constant pressure. They spent 3 days discussing it, weighing financial security against mission integrity, personal comfort against larger purpose. In the end, it was Eliza who made the decision. "We turn it down," she said. "Not because we don't want the money, God knows we do, but because some things matter more than financial security. Your grandfather's vision matters. Making this research accessible to small farmers matters. Building something meaningful instead of just profitable matters." "Are you sure?" Alexander asked, needing to know she was making this choice freely, not out of obligation or pressure. "I'm sure," Eliza said firmly. "I didn't spend 2 years protecting this place just to sell it out at the first big offer. We find another way. We always do." They declined the corporate offer and instead pursued a different model. Open-source licensing that made the varieties available to any orchardist, while charging nominal fees that funded ongoing research. It meant slower growth and continued financial pressure, but it aligned with their values in a way the exclusive deal never could have. Alexander's father was furious when he found out. "You turned down $3 million, he said over the phone, voice tight with disbelief. "Are you insane?" "No," Alexander said calmly. "I'm principled. There's a difference." "Principles don't pay bills, Alexander. What happens when the next financial crisis hits, when the market for heritage varieties dries up? You'll have nothing to fall back on." "We'll have the work itself," Alexander countered. "The knowledge that we built something that matters, that helps people, that makes the world slightly better. That's worth more to me than $3 million. His father hung up without another word, and Alexander knew he'd probably damaged their relationship beyond easy repair. But standing in the greenhouse with Eliza later that day, watching her carefully tend seedlings that would become next year's stock, he knew he'd made the right choice. "My father thinks I'm an idiot," he told her. "Your father thinks anything that doesn't maximize profit is idiotic," Eliza replied, without looking up from her work. "You're not trying to maximize profit, you're trying to maximize impact. That's not idiotic, Alexander, that's brave." Winter came again, their second at Thornfield, and with it a settling into permanence. Alexander officially moved his architecture practice to the estate, converting one wing into a studio where he designed sustainable buildings and consulted on heritage preservation projects. Eliza enrolled part-time in Cornell's landscape design program, finally pursuing the degree she'd deferred for so long. They were building something real, not just the research facility and business, but a life together that honored both their backgrounds while creating something new. Alexander learned to cook the working-class comfort foods Eliza had grown up with, and she learned to appreciate the cultural events that fed his architectural passion. They found community among the farmers and researchers and local artists in the Hudson Valley, people who valued authenticity over status. On a cold December evening, almost exactly 2 years after Alexander had first driven through Thornfield's gates, he asked Eliza to marry him. They were in the walled garden where she'd first shown him his grandfather's vision. Snow falling softly around them. And he didn't have a ring because he wanted her to choose one that felt right for who they were together. "I love you," he said simply. "I love who you are and who we are together. I love the life we're building and the values we share and the way you challenge me to be better than I thought I could be. Will you marry me?" Eliza laughed and cried and said yes, pulling him into a kiss that tasted of snow and promise and everything they'd fought so hard to build. Yes, absolutely yes. They married in May, surrounded by apple blossoms, and the community they'd created, Dr. Chen and her family, the farmers who bought their stock, the Cornell students who'd become like younger siblings to Eliza, the few family members who'd chosen to accept their relationship rather than judge it. Alexander's mother attended, though his father did not, sending a brief note that was almost, but not quite, an apology. "He'll come around eventually," Alexander told Eliza on their wedding night. "Or he won't. Either way, we have everything we need right here." And they did. Thornfield Estate had transformed from a bankruptcy waiting to happen into a thriving research and teaching facility. The disease-resistant apple varieties were being adopted by orchards across the Northeast, helping small farmers combat climate change challenges while preserving genetic diversity. Alexander's architecture practice was flourishing, designing buildings that prioritized sustainability and community impact over raw profit. But more than any professional success, they had each other, a partnership built on shared values, mutual respect, and the kind of love that grows stronger through facing challenges together. They had heated debates about business decisions and tearful conversations about family tensions and joyful planning sessions about the future they were building. "Do you ever regret it?" Eliza asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the orchards. "Turning down the easy money, choosing this complicated life instead?" "Never," Alexander said honestly. "Not once. This is exactly where I'm meant to be, with you, building something meaningful, living a life that feels authentic instead of just impressive." Eliza leaned against his shoulder, content in the kind of companionable silence that comes from truly knowing another person. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said softly, "of what we've built here, of choosing purpose over profit." "I think he'd be proudest of us finding each other," Alexander replied, "of the partnership we've created. That's the real inheritance, Eliza, not the estate or the research, but the example of fighting for what matters." As stars emerged in the darkening sky and lights flickered on in the greenhouses where night shift researchers tended experimental crops, Alexander pulled his wife closer and felt the deep satisfaction of a life well chosen. They'd saved Thornfield, yes, but more importantly, they'd built something together that was bigger than either of them alone could have imagined. The future still held uncertainties, business challenges, family complexities, the ongoing work of bridging their different worlds. But they'd face it all together, two people from vastly different backgrounds who'd found common ground in shared values and built a love strong enough to weather any storm. And in the end, that was the truest inheritance of all. Not bankrupt estates or botanical research, but the choice to love courageously, to build purposefully, and to create a life that honored both where they'd come from and who they wanted to become together. The groundskeeper's daughter and the Manhattan architect had saved more than just an estate. They'd saved each other, and in doing so, had built something far more valuable than any amount of money could measure. A partnership rooted in respect, sustained by love, and flourishing with purpose. That was worth everything.